The Weimar Culturati could not, they said, endure the 19th century world, but they could triumph over it within their own sphere. They acted like the god of an ancient legend in reverse. When they extinguished the stars and the earth was once again without form and void, when they had remade the living soul of man in their image after their likeness, when they had breathed into his nostrils the breath of anti-life, when they saw everything that they had made, and behold, it was ruins. Ruins and astrology and word salads and toilet training and diseased lungs. Then they knew that their triumph had been complete, and they were prepared for the rest to rest from all their work. When the seventh day came, however, they found that something inexplicable had grown up in their garden of ruin. At first, they could hear only distant howls and approaching steps. It took a while before they were able to see the thing, but at last they recognized the face of Adolf Hitler. Hello, everybody. This is History Valley. I'm your co-host, Liran, today with our frequent guest, James Stevens Valliant. How are you, good sir?
I'm well. How are you?
Very well. Today we're discussing the book, The Cause of Hitler's Germany, written by Dr. Leonard Peikoff, and it was published in 1982, I believe. Yes.
Well, the book, The Ominous Parallels, from which this is extracted, was originally published in 1982. I'm not quite sure what the date was, but a different, focusing on just one aspect of the book, was separately published as The Cause, The Rise of Hitler, right?
I understand. Now, I understand you have a relationship with the author of the said book.
I certainly do. I've known Dr. Peikoff now for about 40 years. I studied with him in New York City back in the early 1980s, got to know him in the 1980s through various lectures and seminars and other activities, and was invited to participate in seminars that he gave at his home on his forthcoming book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. He's best known as the world's leading expert and exponent of the philosophy of objectivism, the philosophy of the late novelist philosopher Ayn Rand. I regard him as my chief mentor in things philosophy. He taught me so much, it's hard to fairly even describe. But yes, he is my teacher, he is my friend, he is my mentor.
So you know that his works fairly well, to say the least.
Yeah.
Including this one.
Yeah, I've gone through it a few times, yeah.
Okay. Did you discuss it with the author?
I am a historian by nature and inclination, and Dr. Leonard Peikoff has written two of his most important books are on the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history. So there is a close simpatico between his ideas on the nature of historical development and causation and my own. Or if I can put it this way, his historiography and mine are identical, pretty much.
Now, can you tell us what exactly is Weimar Culture in Weimar, Germany?
Well, it was that period of time before the rise of National Socialism, before Adolf Hitler came to power. There was a period of time when unified Germany experienced a republic, a parliamentary form of government, prior to the totalitarianism brought on by Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party. World War I had seen the end of the Kaiser's Germany, the German Empire. The Kaiser was compelled to abdicate when Germany lost World War I, and the powers that had been victimized by Germany, France, Belgium, Great Britain, reparations were demanded, and a republic was demanded. No longer would the semi-authoritarian empire of Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm be tolerated. The Kaisers were out. But Weimar culture, getting back to your question, refers to the overall culture, the philosophy, the art, literature, music, politics, even the science that was going on in Germany in the 1920s. And it was a sea change. It was different than previous cultures. It has been said by many people, not just the philosopher Ayn Rand, but has been noted by many people that World War I marked a visible change in a culture.
Particularly Stefan Zweig has said this.
I'm sorry?
Particularly Stefan Zweig, the novelist, with his book, The World of Yesterday, has noted this.
Many people noted it. You know, when World War I began, there were people who said such eloquent things. The lights are going out all over Europe. I wonder if they will be lit again in our lifetime. And but the truth is that when you look at the art, when you look at the ideas that were popular, when you look at the politics that dominated, it was different, and a whole new regime began to flex its practical muscles.
Now, this is beyond just the regime of the National Socialist Party.
Yes, but Weimar culture, you know, Germany was a leading place for ideas and culture. They were one of the most literate societies, one of the most advanced societies in the world. They produced many of the greatest scientists and historians of the period were coming out of Germany.
Especially on this channel, you might be aware of the Dutch radicals and Bauer and another Bauer and Slimacher and other such luminaries. All of those come from this period.
Prior to the
a little before, yeah, but
that's right. In the 1800s, the 19th century, in my view, scientific history was basically developed and discovered by German historians. They were the ones who pioneered archaeology. They were the ones who pioneered critical textual analysis for ancient texts. And for people who are familiar with this channel, they may be familiar with many of the great German scholars of the 1800s who basically gave us the entire field of critical biblical scholarship. And so great things were happening in German culture in the 1800s. Think of the brilliant romantic music that was going on the continent of Europe at the time. And earlier in the 19th century, the great German poet Friedrich Schiller or the French novelist Victor Hugo, it was a different world, a world in which progress, technology was considered good, technological progress was considered inevitable and unlimited, and the sky's the limit, and everyone looked forward to economic and technological progress. The art was romantic in Ayn Rand's sense, in the Hugo Schiller sense, including the music and the literature.
Ah, yes, the operettas.
You know, Viennese operettas towards the turn of the 20th century were some of the most benevolent expressions of Western music ever. Yeah, some people have said that Vienna, German, not in German,
yeah, okay, it's the same
German,
culture, it's
but a German culture, German language city, was the apex of culture at the turn of the 20th century. After World War I, a visible change occurred in Western culture, and Germany being at the cutting edge of German culture and German philosophy. They were called the land of poets and philosophers. The cutting edge was really on the vanguard of the cultural changes that had been brewing, let's put it this way, for over a century.
Now, some phrase I heard you repeat, and I agree with this, is art is the barometer of a culture's values. Let us examine the art of the Weimar Republic, step by step, starting with the Magic Mountain. Now, by Thomas Mann. Now, have you read this book?
Yes, I have.
Oh my!
Thomas Mann wrote, and it's probably his most famous work, The Magic Mountain. It is often regarded as the book of Weimar culture, and Mann is considered one of the great exponents of Weimar literature. No doubt about it. That's why as a university undergraduate, I was assigned to read The Magic Mountain. It is that important in the development of German literary culture.
Now, can you summarize the plot of Magic Mountain? There's not a lot of it, I understand.
There's not a lot of plot. It largely takes place in sanity. It's a book of a bunch of conversation, and it's a book of a bunch of what I would call travelogue details. But apart from the conversations and the travelogue details, there is one of the outstanding features of it is there's a precious little plot. It's basically people at a sanitarium having a conversation about the meaning of life. And there are two figures who represent two different views of life, and our protagonist is trying to sort through and figure out these two opposing different views of life. So it's considered one of the most important philosophical novels ever written, because there's so much philosophy going on in it. It's a discussion of philosophy, but it's pretty much plotless. And what plot there is utterly disconnected to what the characters are discussing, or only in the vaguest sense. It's not as though there's a story that tells a theme.
You just described every stoner movie out there.
I'm sorry?
You just described every stoner movie out there. But this wasn't touted as just like, I mean, well, yeah, that's what those movies are.
But what it presented was a false alternative of philosophies, a pro-life and a pro-death philosophy. And the hero of the story, or the hero, I use that word very loosely,
doesn't do anything.
The main focus of the story doesn't really do anything, but he learns that that the only rational way to go about life, or the only way that seems to work for him, using the word again, rational, very loosely, is a compromise between life and the needs of life and the needs of death. I mean, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. I could, you can get into that in greater detail, but it's a long-winded, to make it short, it's a long-winded philosophical novel, largely set in a sanitarium. The guy is in love with tragically Claudia, a tragically sick young woman, and as I say, there's not much plot to it, but it is a tragic plot, mostly disconnected from the buckets of philosophy that are discussed along the way.
Sounds awful. How did you read it?
By holding my nose. I did not enjoy the novel. It was one of my least favorite novels. Art reflects the cultural assumptions of the time. You won't get an audience if you're right, if it's not out there. And the artist himself is generally not an original philosopher. Okay. But there are periods where you can say there are things that connect Renaissance art or Romantic art or Baroque art. Oh. When you get to Weimar culture, what seems to connect it all as well are philosophical ideas that may or may not be known to the novelist. In this case, Thomas Mann, he was philosophically aware and was trying to make a philosophical point. Masses agree with him. He becomes a success.
Well, Thomas Mann was quite successful.
Quite successful, indeed.
Okay. Now, this is from the book, The Cause of Hitler's Germany, talking about the book Magical Mountain. Peikoff says, quote, he's quoting the book of Magic Mountain, man, Kastrop, the main character, thinks is a master of contradictions. They exist through him, and so he is grander than they, grander than death, too grand for it, grander than life, too grand for it. The recklessness of death, he decides, is inherent in life, but one must award sovereignty in one's thoughts and actions to life, so long as one always remembers to keep faith with death in one's heart. Settembrini, a character in the book, he decides is too rational. You do need to hold your nose when reading this. Mm-hmm. It is love, not reason, that is stronger than that. Only love, not reason, gives sweet thoughts. And Peikoff says, as the caliber of these statements indicate, man, despite the abundance of abstract talk in the book, does not take ideas seriously.
Well, that's it. The advocate.
I love that last line. I'm sorry.
Right. No. Well, in the book, the guy Castorp is trying to decide between these two philosophies. He decides the pro-reason guy is unreasonable. You can't be pro-life. You can't be pro-reason. But then again, if you look at the character, he is a caricature of what they thought reason was. And so it's this false alternative that's being offered.
Yeah, a straw man.
Think of it, a straw man of reason. Exactly. But the idea of reason that philosophers had been promoting since Kant.
So this is what all the Germans, all the major German philosophers at the time thought reason means. It's Settembrini, who is a windbag. He's kind of savvy. He's rude. He's
Everything's a joke, and he's trying to offend the traditional sensibilities, and yeah, and so he realizes that no, if you're gonna, we can't be pro reason and pro life consistently. We have to make a compromise psychologically and morally with death.
Now, one of the only plot moments in the book is when this character decides to go to war in World War One. And this is there's another character who's kind of, let's say it nicely, he's kind of stupid. And he gets convinced by him because he says to this guy, he says to Kastrop, our sacred duty to feel, fulfilling young man, is godlike. That's the Dutch character who told that to Kastrop.
Now think of that.
Yeah, think of that. Another famous novelist at the time was a man by the name of Gerhard Hauptmann, who wrote The Weavers.
There's a play.
Did you read that play?
No, I blessedly have relied upon the descriptions. I don't think I could sit through the play The Weavers, frankly.
Would you describe the play to us?
Well, from as it's been described to me from multiple sources, not just
Okay,
Dr. P.
fair enough.
It is rank worker socialist propaganda. There is no hero of the story. The hero is really a social class. Everyone is being buffeted by economic forces beyond their control, which is exactly what, of course, Karl Marx, his economic and historical theories imply. Humans are determined by material economic forces.
Correct.
And The Weavers is a beautiful example of that, how these workers are completely pawns to the circumstances around them, slaves to the circumstances around them, victims to the circumstances around them. The hero is the suffering working class of the weavers. There's really no individual weaver at all. It is, I think it would be, as described, a nightmare I couldn't sit through, as there really is no point other than heavy-handed socialist, Marxist socialist propaganda. What's interesting about this guy is that he went, the guy Hauptmann himself went through a remarkable, what some people would say a radical change, but of course was no big change at all. He went from being a Marxist communist to someone who supported Adolf Hitler.
Right, he went from international socialism to national socialism.
National socialism.
All right. Popular artistic movement at the time was the Dadaist movement. What is Dadaism? It sounds silly.
Well, it is, when people think of the bizarre nature of contemporary art, they very often think of the middle and latter part of the 20th centuries, with pop art and, Jackson Pollock and stuff. But it all began in Weimar culture. This absurdity of splotches and stuff. It's true that the expressionist artistic movement had already reached maturity by World War I, but it really became dominant in visual arts in the 1920s. People like Paul Klee or Vasily Kandinsky, who were dominating the world now of German painting, becoming leading German visual artists, were no longer representational. I have to bring up abstract expressionism here, because one of the broader aspects of this revolution in subjective art, where we no longer are representational, we're no longer trying to show you an object you'd recognize in reality, just stylized to invoke certain values. No, there's just geometric forms, color blotches, a round circle with just orange or something. The reason I bring that up is because we've become completely detached from reality. There was another group who thought, oh, no. We don't want to detach from reality. We want to show you exactly how reality is itself always art. And so they would show toilets, urinals, collages with bus transfers, just a slop of reality in collage form. Our great Dadaists said it well, and please forgive my language, art is shit. I did not make up that quote. That is a positive quote describing Dadaism by a Dadaist.
One thing that happened in this period was a development in music called atonal music. Now, yeah. I know some music, and every time I go to a guitar teacher, and every time I play a wrong note, he said, you started playing atonal music. if I'm late, I can say, hey, I practices John Cage's 8 minutes in silence.
Well, you know, there's a joke that says
Yeah.
if you hit the wrong note, it's jazz.
I think that's kind of
I
disparaging to
think
jazz.
jazz is better. I think jazz is a step higher than that, but atonal music is not. When you're talking about, and the great exponent of this in Weimar culture, in German culture at the time, was a guy named Arnold Schoenberg, and he was an advocate of atonality, of atonality. Now, again, there had been a development of cultural development to this throughout the course of the 19th century. That's what it is. It's the rejection of beauty and melody and harmonic integration within music. What we're seeing in Weimar culture is the actual end of harmony and melody as values in music, in Western music.
So what
Or
is it
in
supposed
Thomas
to?
Mann, the end of plot and the connection between theme and plot. I think the art is the basic barometer and of a culture, and you can tell a great deal about a culture and the direction it's heading in with the artists. It's not that artists are the ones coming up with these ideas, but they're the ones giving them eloquent expression and therefore giving a feedback effect within the culture for those ideas, reinforcing those ideas in the popular mind. And that's exactly what Weimar Germany did. The cultural exponents, whether on the right or the left.
One part of Weimar culture was the politics of the time, which were pretty tumultuous, to say the least. What were the major political parties in Germany in 1920 up until 1933?
Well, basically, the parties that were driving politics were at the extremes, and they were perceived extremes, although they had a whole lot in common. The conservatives were basically arguing for old German nationalist values. And it's a curious thing because environmentalism was part of it. A back to nature movement was part of the right. It was questioning technological and economic progress as such. And they wanted to get back to the soil and the spirit of the
I think
German
blood and soil is the way it's described
blood.
in the book.
Yeah, right, exactly. Blood and soil, getting back to their German roots, their ethnic German roots, and that was grounded in German nationalism, which, as we'd said, was on the rise in the previous century. That is what's dominating on the right. The parties on the left are dominated by the communists. The Bolshevik Revolution had already happened in Russia and had driven Russia out of participating in World War I. But communism was spreading throughout the continent of Europe in a very strong way at this time. Marxist ideas were already influencing Great Britain. Well, you notice that the Labour Party elects its first prime minister in the 1920s, for what it's worth. But all over the world, the philosophy of the German philosopher Karl Marx was very much dominating the left. And so it's a form of international socialism that was being advocated by the communists of the left, whereas a form of nationalist socialism was being advocated on the right. Now, there were more parties than just the ultra parties on each side.
No,
And
but they weren't that different.
but they were not that different.
Okay.
The Social Democrats were the soft sell of socialism, if you will. They didn't advocate violence, street violence, whereas the other parties joined in with your nascent Nazis, which began before that, the youth groups that preceded them, and the Communist Party were all happy to engage in street violence and intimidation on the streets. Both the fascist side and the communist side were willing to do that. The Social Democrats, which for a time looked like they might be the dominant party, were advocating in effect socialism, but by a peaceful means. That was the key difference. Now, there was a small and relatively insignificant party that basically died out that was advocating old-fashioned liberalism, and at least a kind of old-fashioned liberalism. Perhaps the leading intellectual exponent in this party was Max Weber, one of the fathers of sociology. He was actually a friend of the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. He was sympathetic to old liberalism, but in a sense, his position was more disturbing of all. There is no truth. There is no right and wrong. There are no answers. Nobody can really know, were the kind of things that he was saying. And of course, if you're trying to defend liberalism and the first thing out of your mouth is, who could know anything anyway?
It would be very difficult to convince somebody. From Peacock's book, he says somebody saying of Weber, they must not, Weber told the students, be taken in by religious dogmatists or by irrational charlatans, left or right, who pretend to offer solutions to the world problem. The fact, he explains, there are no solutions. Certainty is unattainable by men, knowledge is provisional, values are relative, scholars are merely specialists doing technical job detached from life, science has nothing to say about morality or politics. If that's your guy, who you're betting on, you better just quit.
He's one of the best intellectuals from the best party. It was one of the smallest parties,
Yep.
but he's one of the best intellectuals from comparatively, and it's compared to what kind of standard? Comparatively, by far the best of the political parties. It was one of the most minor, and it became less and less significant as time wore on. And here you got Weber, one of the leading intellectual lights from that party, saying there are no answers, saying that we have to separate morality because there is no certain morality. When the only voice of semi-reason is saying reason can't provide the answers, you're doomed. It's a question of whether it's only a question of whether a Stalin type or a Hitler type takes over at that point.
Which one was it? Kidding.
The point is that Max Weber was a radical skeptic. And when you have a radical skeptic of that kind being the leading intellectual voice for the most sane political party in Germany at the time, they're doomed. As time wore on, it became more and more clear that it was going to be a battle between the National Socialists and our communists, the International Socialists. And people basically had to take sides. The National Socialists were popular at the time, but they never had a majority. But it was a parliamentary system where no single party ever really had an outright majority of the votes. The reason really why the National Socialists came to power is because each of the other parties thought that they could use them. The right thought that they could use them for their purposes, and even the communists thought that they could use them for their purposes. Get rid of these moderate social democrats for us, and we'll be the alternative.
If I remember correctly, the National Socialist Party and the Communist Party joined forces in November of 1932 to back a protest of the transportation workers in Berlin. The Germans even had a joke for this. The Nazis are like beefsteak, brown on the outside, red on the inside, and you had members from going from one group to the next and then back. It was funny.
This was the key to the Nazi success. They were offering the essence of what each side of the political spectrum wanted most.
Right. In a sense, you could call them a radical centrist party.
A radical centrist party. In one sense. Yeah, exactly, because they were taking the elements that were most popular on each side, say the back to nature, back to our German roots part of
the general Stalinism, not at all the right parties were racist. Some of them definitely were, but definitely there was an element of Stalinism. There was an element of Stalinism always in them. No, undoubtedly.
Right. Undoubtedly. So they appealed to crude racism. Yes. I mean, on the continent of Europe, anti-Semitism has been endemic poison for centuries. And as is well known, Hitler just simply brought that to the fore within his party. Otherwise, he was appeasing the basic demands on each side. He was a worker socialist.
Yes.
All you have to do is there are dozens of speeches in which Hitler and his friends articulate that they are advocating the regulation of the economy. Now, unlike the communists, they didn't take over title, but they did regulate every aspect of the German economy.
Right. So
hiring, firing, what you charged, what you made, every single economic. And there were businessmen who went to jail for failing to run their quote, I put theirs, their business in a way that complied with the National Socialist demands. So it was a kind of worker socialism that would sort of appease the basic quest of the left, and it was a back to nature nationalist movement that would appease the basic motivation behind the right.
And one famous quote by Hitler, told by Rausling, is, "The difference between them and myself is that I have really put into practice what these peddlers and pen pushers have timidly begun." He's talking about the communists. "I had only to develop logically what social democracy repeatedly failed in because of its attempt to realize its evolution within the framework of democracy. National socialism is what Marxism might have been if it could have broken its absurd and artificial ties with the democratic order." And in another place, he says, this is from Rausling's Recollections, "There is above all genuine revolutionary feeling which is alive everywhere in Russia, except where there are Jewish Marxists. I have always made allowance for this circumstance and given orders that former communists are to be admitted to the party at once. The petit bourgeois social democrat and the trade union boss will never make a national socialist, but the communist always will," says Rausling that Hitler had told him. So this is from
Rauschning as a source has been questioned. The accuracy of his own recollections has been questioned.
Yes.
And much of what he said may or may not be true. He's used as a source by Peikoff, but he's really not needed. And Rauschning is really only articulating what you can, in those cases where Peikoff cites him, things you can find in many other sources. But there is no question. I mean, you can hear it just in the name of their party, the Nationalist Socialist Party.
And it's not a ruse. A lot of people, especially sympathetic to socialism, say, "Oh, it's just a ruse. They're just taking people to enact capitalism." Come on.
Capitalism?
I suppose they have.
If capitalism has any meaning at all, the
communists to these people,
and the National Socialists were as far away from it as you can imagine. They were totalitarians who gave people no economic freedom or choice. Both sides. That's what they agreed upon. Capitalism was evil.
Well, I mean, on one side says capitalism is a Jewish invention, and the other side says, yeah.
Right. You'll notice.
Funny, but it's true.
Exactly. You'll notice how the Marxists line up neatly. And there was all kinds of anti-Semitism among European communists.
Yes.
It's well known.
Marx himself was very anti-Semitic, even though he is ethnically Jewish.
But that was, in effect, that's the choice. By 1933-34, that's the choice that Germans confronted. Given that choice, comparatively more people voted for the Nazis into parliament than voted for the communists into parliament, and that's how Hitler got elected chancellor.
Why do you think the Communist Party lost rather than the National Socialist Party losing?
Because Adolf Hitler appealed to a wider base of values.
Yeah.
He appealed to a much wider base of values, conservative. Many of.
Let's ask this: could the communists have appealed to the same base?
Not completely. They could have. They could have. But you notice it didn't need a majority any more than it needed a majority in Russia to take over. Like the Nazis, all they needed was a large enough minority to take over and no real opposition. And that again was the formula. So
but there was real opposition.
In Germany, it seems to me that it's much more likely that a nationalist, racist form of total socialism would take over than an internationalist form.
Now, James, you studied economics, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so some people have said that inflation was the reason that one of the main reasons that the National Socialist Party got to power. What do you think of this?
No, I think that's flatly wrong. It is true that in the 1920s and early 1930s, Germany faced a series of economic crises. But I will make a general point about crises in general. Whatever the kind of crisis, economic or otherwise, a crisis does not tell you how to react to it. A crisis may force you to react, do something, but it doesn't tell you what to do. But you'll notice that Germany basically overcame its inflation crisis by the mid-1920s.
Yes.
Crisis did create a sense of desperation on the part of many ordinary Germans, so that they were getting interested in politics and taking extreme answers on politics. Unfortunately, they were going in the exactly opposite, the wrong direction for curing it. They wanted more welfare state, more government spending, more of the very thing that was causing it. And it was only when there was some relief in the mid-1920s from that they got a handle on it. Another major reason was American investment. By the late 1920s and by the early 1930s, the United States of America was heavily invested in the hopes of shoring up the German economy. America was very, very heavily invested. Private businesses in America were heavily invested. And when the Great Depression happened in America, when the stock market crashed and the resulting decline in American production happened, America catches the flu and the world catches pneumonia. In Germany's case, it was all the greater because they were particularly dependent on American capital. But again, that economic crisis doesn't tell you how to respond to it. It tells you need a response. It doesn't tell you vote Adolf Hitler in, does it? But that's in effect what they did.
A common theory in Germany on the reason for the situation, which was losing World War I, was the Dolstos idea, which translates to knife in the back or stab in the back, backstab, betrayal. That's what it means. Which was the idea that, oh well, we could have won World War I if we didn't quote unquote accept the treaty and accept the treaty and withdraw. Now this is nonsense. I mean, if you look at
nonsense on its face. It's true that the war had been World War I had for several years been largely a stalemate between Britain and Germany. And on the battlefields of France and Belgium, as I say, they were fighting over meters in the course of a day. It was a pathetic stalemate that was going on year after year after year. Once America got involved towards the end of the war, no, Germany lost. The American army marched into Berlin and forced the abdication of the Kaiser.
Like in that movie Casablanca.
Yes.
They mentioned it in Casablanca.
Right. I just mentioned.
The Dolstos idea was a very big factor in German chauvinism, apparently both on the right and the left.
Yes.
Right-leaning people and left-leaning people. I haven't found it in left parties as much.
Well, there were deep resentments that cut across. I think it was just a psychological thing more than even a political thing. There were deep resentments about how the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany. But then again, Germany were the ones who invaded Belgium, raping Belgium, forcing Britain into that war. The Germans were the first ones to use poison gas in that war. So stab in the back, well, you guys didn't need to start that war.
Well, it's true that they didn't surrender. However, one thing was certain, there was huge resentment in Germany across all social classes.
Well, this is true. Germans in general felt a huge resentment about that Treaty of Versailles and the somewhat onerous reparations that it demanded of a now destroyed Germany.
One historian, John David Lewis, who I think, do you know him?
I have read his work and I have met him.
Okay. Who is also, I believe, connected to Leonard Peikoff, the guy who wrote the book
I'm
talking about.
Yes, a friend and associate when he was alive with Leonard Peikoff.
I see. And he writes in a different book, 17 years after World War I, intellectuals and politicians broke with reality and reconstructed their history. They poised Germany as a victim of deep betrayal. By 1920s, the Dolstos had become a foundation myth. We are in a reduced position, said the mythmakers, because of a criminal conspiracy against our nation. John David Lewis, Nothing Less Than Victory, Decisive War, and the Lessons of History.
I agree. So, what can you say? It's well known, but that's a well-known aspect of the rise of National Socialism.
Right, but this was something both on the left and the right. That's not an.
I think it was a widespread view among Germans, and I think it cut across parties.
So I think at this point it's clear, at least to me, it's clear that how the rise of Nazi Germany was due to the fact that the National Socialist Party could placate the desires and sentiments of the population as a whole more consistently than the rest of the parties.
That's right.
Right. As we can see in art, a heavy emphasis on feeling, instinct. As we can see in politics, an emphasis on radical, collectivistic, socialistic, and chauvinistic, here meaning nationalistic, policies. And combining a sense of resentment common amongst all classes of society.
Yes. I would note that some of the things that we've discussed along the way here, for example, abstract expressionism, were regarded by the Nazis as decadent forms of art.
Yes, the genre they called it.
degenerate, they called it. And so they were more into more representational forms of art, the Nazis. But this did not mean that they did not share the underlying emotionalism and irrationalism that motivated.
Yeah, no, the message, you can disagree with how the message, I mean, they could disagree with how the message came, but if you're telling, look, it's all about feeling, yeah, but you have the wrong feeling, so sucks to be you.
Right.
But it's all
Our
about
blue is
feeling.
telling us one thing, your blue is telling you another thing. Right.
Well, you know, it's all in the blood, so to speak, for them.
That's right.
Eventually,
Because if it is a matter of emotion and instinct, as their philosophers had been telling them, Schopenhauer was telling them life is hell. Nietzsche was saying,
power, get power. That's what Nietzsche told them.
exactly. I mean, Hegel, again, the Nazis were officially against Hegel, but Hegel was the guy who sort of laid all the groundwork for totalitarianism in Hitler.
Yes.
And so whatever Hitler's official position on Hegel, Hegel was one of the fathers, the German philosopher Hegel,
yes.
who was one of the fathers of it. And all of these guys, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, you name it. Even as we get into Hitler's time, the existentialist philosopher Heidegger, who was a supporter, one of the leading philosophers in Europe at the time, was a supporter of Adolf Hitler. All the way there, all these cats trace their origins back to another German philosopher, Immanuel Kant.
Right. Now, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant is called subjectivism, correct?
It's a kind of radical subjectivism,
right.
But it, depending on how you look at it, Immanuel Kant's defense of reason was an assault on reason. It's telling us that in effect we can't know reality in itself, that reason is incompetent, and that we have to, in effect, rely upon, that's right, our emotions ultimately. Philosophers laid the groundwork for the culture that gave rise to Adolf Hitler.
Okay. One thing I did find very interesting in the book is that objectivity was a moral crime in Nazi Germany. Now, it wasn't that you were objective, go to jail, but it offended the sensibilities of the lawmakers so much that any display of it would probably get you in a lot of trouble.
That's right. See, in art, it's out. In science, it's out. In politics, it's out. And you see what I'm saying?
Right, because in their description, because it's very simple. Objectivity is the opposite of instinct.
Right.
One guy said, higher up in the National Socialist Party said, "We aren't objective. We're German." Hitler in one speech says, "Logic is an invention of the Jews to screw us Aryans over," which is funny if it wasn't so sad.
Sickening.
Yes.
Sickening.
It's funny too because it's so stupid.
Well, his enemies, the communists, believed in polylogism too.
Yes,
they assaulted
logic.
There's bourgeois logic versus proletarian logic, and your social class determines how you think. And therefore, if whatever your argument is, if you are of this class, we can dismiss it or accept it.
Yes. Either people talk with each other and settle the problems through discourse, or they just beat each other over the head until there's no one to talk.
And that kind of subjectivism was pioneered by men like Kant and Hegel.
Right, and implemented in this land of poets and philosophers by people who listen to poets and philosophers.
And it was the poets and philosophers and painters and art and writers
and politicians
and politicians who all, and what they assumed and what they and whatever their political differences, it's the philosophical premises that they shared that the Nazi synthesis or the National Socialist synthesis consisted of. They took the deepest values that were shared.
The chauvinism of the right, which was chauvinism on the left too, and they took the economic totalitarianism of the left, which was on the right too. You see how this is going? You see how you can do it about every aspect of the policy.
Right, but that irrationalism and that emotionalism that we associate, for example, with the National Socialist group mass gatherings and Hitler's speeches, there would be this fiery, emotional appeal to the most base popular emotions. He would just get all frenzied in his emotion, and the people would be it's like a religious revival meeting. People would just get emotionally stirred and carried away.
To summarize, a particular passage in the book I found very striking. But the Nazis defended their policies, and by policies he means, well, what we just talked about. It continued, and the country did not rebel. It accepted the Nazi argument. Selfish individuals may be unhappy, the Nazis said, But we have established in Germany as the ideal system, socialism. And the Nazi uses this term is not restricted to a theory of economics. It is to be understood in a fundamental sense. Socialism for the Nazis denotes the principle of collectivism as such and its corollary statism in every field of human action, including but not limited to economics. To be a socialist, says Goebbels, is to submit the I to the Tao. Socialism is sacrificing the individual to the whole. By this definition, the Nazis practice what they preach. They practice it at home and then abroad. No one can claim that they not sacrifice enough individuals.
What can you say on that? Goebbels and Hitler were as explicit on this point as you can possibly be. They were opposed to individualism, individual interest, the subordination of the individual, and the demand for the sacrifice of the individual for the collective, the Volk, the Aryan race, the German people. And you are going to sacrifice if we have to call upon you to die and suffer for it. And you can see it in the enthusiasm of young National Socialists, women lining up to be part of the breeding program and so forth for Adolf Hitler. It was
that was actually a thing. That was actually a thing.
Yeah, astonishing how popular Hitler was among the youth.
Yeah, he was popular amongst the universities. That's how we got
exactly. The youth movements and the universities were some of Adolf Hitler's strongest supporters. And as I say, Adolf Hitler was appealing to the values, whether or not on the left or the right, to the broad values that everyone was basically accepting. Opposition to reason, opposition to individualism, opposition to the free market.
Or rights and or the classical notion of rights.
Precisely.
So, in short, what was the cause of Hitler's Germany? The idea of the Germans.
The philosophical ideas of Germany, the philosophers of Germany were the direct cause of the art, the politics, and the general cultural demeanor of Weimar Germany and the rise of Adolf Hitler.